What if the Mongols never went conquering? In this timeline, Genghis Khan dies as a child when he's forced to live out on the steppe by himself. And so in this timeline, no one unifies the Mongol tribes. How would history be different if the largest continuous empire in history never existed? What would the borders be like? What would culture be like? That is the question of this alternate history. A major difference in this timeline would be that Russia would remain divided. In our timeline, for the Mongols, Russia was a patchwork of states warring with each other. But in our timeline, the Mongols conquered all of Russia, meaning that when Muscovy revolted, it took all of Russia with it, thus creating a united Russia. But without the Mongols to conquer all of Russia, that would mean that Russia would remain divided in this timeline, like Italy or Germany was in our timeline. In our timeline in the 16th and 17th century, Russia and Poland-Lithuania fought very bloody wars against each other for control over Eastern Europe in the 16th and 17th century. But in this timeline, with Russia being divided, that would mean that Poland would be able to gain homage over the Russian states, and thus Poland would gain control of Eastern Europe in this timeline. This actually isn't as far-fetched as it sounds. In our timeline, the Poles were able to seize control of Moscow, and the Russo-Polish wars were very closely fought. But the thing is, Poland-Lithuania wasn't so much a real country as it was a collection of nobles that sometimes worked together. So if any pressure is put on Poland-Lithuania at its heart, that means the entire structure falls down like a house of cards. That means that when the Swedes go a-conquering in the 17th and 18th century, they'd be able to conquer Poland and its Russian dependencies pretty easily. But the thing is, there simply aren't enough Swedes to keep up with the Russian movement east into Siberia, so that would mean that the Russians would establish their own state east of the Urals that would be independent from the Swedes. This Russian state would be more egalitarian than the motherland, because the majority of the immigrants would be peasants, and so the entire nobility system would not exist in this land. Whether or not this would turn into democracy is unknown. Tamerlane, being a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, would mean that if Genghis Khan died as a child, neither would Tamerlane exist. Most of Tamerlane's invasions had very little long-term historical effect, but the big one that mattered a lot was that Tamerlane slowed down the Ottoman Empire. In our timeline, Tamerlane's defeat of the Ottoman forces outside Ankara weakened the Ottoman Empire greatly, and prevented them from seizing Constantinople, which they were poised to do. And so if Tamerlane never wiped out the Ottoman army, that would mean that the Ottomans would have seized Constantinople at the turn of the 15th century, 50 years earlier than they did in our timeline. This would mean that the Ottomans would have an extra 50 years to expand into Europe before they started to lag behind technologically, and this would be under some of the greatest generals in world history, and so the Ottomans would likely move further into Europe. In this timeline, the Ottomans would likely conquer Vienna in 1529 because they would already have a larger presence inside Europe, and so their supply lines wouldn't be dangerously lengthened, and so the Habsburgs in Austria would be conquered by the Ottomans. The non-existence of Austria would bring Europe on a very different historical path, with no 30 Years' War and very different balance of power wars in the 18th and 19th century. The 30 Years' War made Europe reconsider why it was doing this whole religious wars thing, and it basically ground them to a halt. But without the 30 Years' War in this timeline, that would mean that Europe likely continued to have religious wars, similarly to the Islamic world in our timeline. Without Austria being a power, that would mean that all of Germany would likely become Protestant, except for the far west, which would be under Spanish and French influence. Also in this timeline, Germany would likely be united earlier. This is for a couple reasons. The first being is that Austria would not annihilate any German state that showed signs of growing. The secondly is that the small German states would want a larger power to protect them from the Ottomans. And thirdly, that without the 30 Years' War, this wouldn't have destroyed the economic power of the German states. If Germany were to be united in the 17th or 18th century, I think that Saxony would be the one to do it. This is for two reasons. Firstly, is that Saxony was simply one of the most powerful of the German states. And secondly, it's because Saxony could expand into the weakening Ottoman Empire to gain more strength. Germany uniting earlier would utterly change European history. It would create so many balance of power wars as the other powers of Europe try to team up against a newly strong Germany, and I can't even begin to get into what the ramifications of that would be. Also, in this timeline, with Germany being united earlier, that would mean they wouldn't be out of the competition for getting the best colonies, and they wouldn't be left with the table scraps of what Britain and France didn't want. So Germany would be a colonial power in this timeline. Now, to utterly change topics, people tend to forget Khwarezm ever existed, mainly because it was so utterly wiped out by the Mongols. There was actually a very vibrant Khwarezmid civilization in what is now Uzbekistan and Turkestan, but the Mongols wiped out the cities and they destroyed the irrigation canals that fed the people, so the civilization basically withered on the vine after the Mongols destroyed it. The reason the Russians were able to conquer Central Asia so easily was that the Mongols had utterly destroyed any urban life. And so, if the Khwarezmid survives, that would mean that they would likely survive as their own Middle Eastern style nation, similar to Iran, and they would be able to maintain their own control from Russia. Another people that were so utterly wiped out by the Mongols that you've never heard of them are the Tanguts. The Tanguts were Tibetans that moved down into the lowlands of the Tarim Basin. A reason the Chinese have been able to conquer the Tarim Basin so easily was that the Tanguts were wiped out, and so if the Tanguts survived as a people, that would mean that they would be able to maintain their own nationhood similar to Tibet in our timeline. Whether or not they'd be conquered by China is unknown, though. Surprisingly, China, being the area that was hit hardest by the Mongols, likely wouldn't be that different if the Mongols never invaded. This is because the Mongols were rapidly Sinicized in China. The Mongols only really had 2 generations inside China before they became Chinese in everything except the last name. And so, they basically started acting like every other Chinese dynasty by the 3rd generation, and so history wouldn't really be that different. In our timeline, the Black Death was imported into Europe by the Mongols, who catapulted bodies of plague victims into defenses in the Crimea to kill the defenders, and this created a spark event that spread the Black Death across Europe. I think that even without the Mongols, a disease similar to the Black Death would have struck Europe in the 14th or 15th century. This is because Europe was just the perfect place for a disease in that time period. Rapidly expanding population, meaning that there wasn't enough land, a cooling temperature, bad sanitation, and cities that were filled with filth meant that Europe was the perfect area for a disease to strike at that time, even if it wasn't the Black Death. I know I'm going to get comments about this, so I'm just going to say it out now. The Abbasid Caliphate still would have collapsed without the Mongols. This is because since the 10th century, it had been a Seljuk puppet state and was only barely showing life in the 13th century when the Mongols trampled it down. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this timeline, please comment or subscribe. Whatifalthist. Thank you for watching.